welcome to Keys of the Kingdom. I'm Brother Gregory, and we're going to be talking about the Kingdom of God again. And I was going to make a little bit of a correction in one of our shows back on the 18th, about 5 minutes in. I was talking about the parliamentary elections of South Africa. And yes, somehow I didn't quite make it as clear. I wasn't trying to go into great detail about how their government functions, but parliamentary systems often, if you elect a particular party head, he reorganizes the entire government. England does this. You see some of this in Canada, although Canada has these provinces, and the provinces have certain authority, much like the states used to have in the United States. Many things were decided on a state level rather than on a congressional level at the federal government. But since power corrupts, what happens is that if you create offices of power, those offices will consolidate that power more and more. And because what you're really doing when you're creating an office of power is you're centralizing the power of the individual. You're giving some. You have X amount of authority to make choices in your life. If you give some of that authority to somebody else, you no longer have that authority. You've given it to somebody else. If you allow them to create debt on your behalf, if you allow them to create agreements on your behalf, such as, treaties. Debt is even more damaging, but treaties can be damaging. And what happens is that you've centralized power in the hands of a few from the many, and they will centralize that power as well. You've let the camel in the tent. He'll let his nose in the tent, and before you know it, the whole camel's going to be in there. And so, yes, the parliamentary government in South Africa, it runs much like that, but they are having a vote. Now, I thought it was around in August, although there's different, it comes up at different times. And if they get 66% majority vote, they can amend their constitution. And the idea is that they want to have more local rule, and they also don't want to have to become a party in order to have that. I don't know whether that will succeed if there's enough factions that see the advantage, because this is what you have. You either have the centralization of power, or you break up in a tribal approach where that power becomes centralized locally, but you still have a dictatorship, but you have it on a local basis. It is the creation of powers of offices of power that is the problem. And why would you do that? Well, it's because you don't want to take back your responsibilities. You want somebody else to be responsible for doing something. This is exactly what was happening, and we get a very limited explanation, but it's clear enough to understand the process in Samuel 8, where the people saw corruption, where people were, through their appeals courts, their cities of refuge, which were appeals courts, there were people getting off or being released or exonerated or protected because of bribes. They were giving bribes to people high up, and they were getting away with things that were unjust. And so they wanted to have a king to straighten out that corruption. Well, they could have done that through the tens, hundreds, and thousands, but they would have had to daily attend to the weightier matters of law, judgment, mercy, and faith. It would have taken more time, more energy, more attentiveness, than they could have dealt with those issues of corruption. But they chose to turn over that power to somebody else, and that was what they call having a king. That's what you did with the Constitution. The states and the individuals in America could have solved some of the problems that were with the Articles of Confederation, but instead somebody came up with the idea of scrapping the whole thing and writing the Constitution of the United States. And we have shown many, many times that the Constitution of the United States is missing numerous items that the Bible tells you must put in a Constitution. It's in Deuteronomy that you must put in a Constitution in order to be, a godly Constitution, a biblical Constitution. And of those items, 4 or 5 different items, only one of them shows up in the Constitution, and the people have become so degenerated that they don't even attend to that one issue that is actually included in the Constitution. What the Constitution does allow is your right to contract, and your right to contract has gotten you into a lot of trouble because you have contracted with institutions that are created by the government, either directly or indirectly, and those contracts have caused you to, become merchandise, to curse your children with debt, because you and your children are a surety for the debt of the United States, and that debt is growing exponentially. And, it's just a matter of historical record. I spent a certain amount of time in the last couple of days. I had to be here for yesterday, and I did a lot of reading on what they call the intellectual dark web. And I looked at a lot of different opinions that people have about the problem, whatever the problem is, and the solution, whatever the solution is. And if you don't identify the problem, you aren't going to identify the solution, and it is the blind leading the blind. There was an article originally that drew my attention that was asking, is the intellectual dark web collapsing? And they were immediately thinking, some people were suggesting anyway, that we needed to get the intellectual dark web more focused by creating certain parameters. You can't get into that electronic network without passing some sort of qualification standards or something to get the people more focused. Well, the reality is that that's not going to work either, and we've seen the same temptation where because we have the Kingdom Network, which is or just network. It's not really kingdom yet. It's just based on geographical areas where you can join an email group based on that geographical area. We don't have all the itemization of topics and all those kinds of things that you go, because it's really not a debate forum. The idea is to get people locally connected and talking about these issues. People talk to their ministers talk to me. I put stuff out. You can put stuff out at Preparing You. You can create web pages, use Facebook. You can use intellectual dark web and promote ideas and discuss them in all those locations. But the purpose of our network is simply to get people connected on a local basis in a process that would be at least remotely described as seeking the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Most of the people that I was looking at, I can't say most of the people on the intellectual dark web, but most of the people I looked at really are blind guides. They don't see the big picture. They're looking, some of them don't see any kind of a picture whatsoever. They're very tunnel vision. Others see a lot of stuff that they learned in school, high school, college, and we've already written articles over and over again showing how the education of the average American has been altered by design. And it has affected the way we look at things like the Constitution. And so we've looked in this series on structure at and we'll probably revisit some of those things in greater detail, people attempting to write different constitutions. And again, in almost every case, I see a lack of vision of the bigger picture. Sometimes a good heart is involved and good intentions are involved, but they don't see the long-range ramifications of what they are suggesting. And they can't really put their plans into a proper model so that they can see them play out. And that's one of the things with this whole global warming issue. If you look at these computer models, everybody has such faith in computer models. Every single one of the computer models that predict global warming have failed over the last 5 or 10 years. Their predictions are not coming true. The opposite, in many cases, is happening, and certainly not the global warming that they have suggested. So what's happening? The models are faulty. They are inaccurate, and there is a lot of evidence that they have fudged the data going into the models as well as the models themselves, the criteria of the models. And so this is a problem because people don't really see how it works. Some of the people that are these veritable geniuses in weather have done a remarkable, they have a remarkable history of predicting the weather over the last 20, 30, 40 years. They say that there is no global warming and that the people do not understand the processes. And they seem to be accurate. They have a lot of scientific skill, but really they have almost a second nature at understanding the values that you need to place on certain parameters in trying to predict the weather. Jet streams and ocean currents and the sun are tremendous factors. And predicting what the sun is going to do, almost nobody has been able to do that because we don't understand the factors that affect the sun. But anyway, all that becomes very complicated, but there seems to be kind of an intuitive skill in some people to predict the weather, and some of those people that have manifested that say that the global warming threat is not really a genuine threat. But people somehow or other think that science is a matter of consensus, like it's a democracy. And, of course, that's a great failing. If democracy was our salvation, then it would not have crucified Christ because it was a minority who followed Christ. Even in Judea, it was a minority who followed Christ. But see, that's the thing in the kingdom. In the kingdom of God, the power of the kingdom is in the hands of the individual. It's not in the hands of collectives. So therefore, democracy is irrelevant. It's about individual rights, individual responsibilities. And that's where you have to go, is take it back to that individual responsibility. And back to the South African question, I don't know whether South Africa Parliament will vote and allow for individual groups to govern themselves. But and it might, because of the fact that they could become so factional that a lot of small factions think this would be to their advantage. Now, obviously, the central powers don't think it would be to their advantage, but if enough of the small factions thought it was, they might get the 66% majority vote that they need to break up the monopoly that Parliament now has, where they can change the whole government simply by electing a party of the majority. We see those battles going on in America where they're trying to outlaw the Electoral College, which was somewhat of a safeguard against that centralization of power by the majority vote, because if they did away with the Electoral College, the people in Los Angeles and New York would decide all the elections, and the way they think would determine who the president was. The reality is we live in a much more mysterious universe, and majorities do have an effect, but I have an article up that I actually just stumbled upon this morning when I was looking around. I was looking for certain things that I had said at one time, and one of them is the mysteries of the universe. You can find it at Preparing You. And it starts off with the universe is divided between light and darkness. but darkness does not exist. It is merely the absence of light. So from one point of view, there is no division, and still from another, there is. So if you follow that, and you carry that principle over to your politics, there is righteousness and there is unrighteousness. And unrighteousness is darkness. It is the lack of righteousness. So if you're really seeking the kingdom of God and his righteousness, you do not need a majority. You don't even need a minority. You need a small fraction, because just a candle will destroy darkness in a room. There's darkness is pervasive throughout the room because there is no light, but just lighting a candle lightens up the whole room. Now, if you come in from the sunlight and you walk into a room that is only lit with a candle, it will seem very dark, but it is not dark. It is not completely dark because there is light there. And so that's where you need to go. If you want to find a solution to the darkness of the world, you don't need a majority vote. You need to light a candle. You need to become that candle. So with that in mind, we'll continue with some of the other things that we were going to talk about today in relationship to structure. I also came across just this morning, and I've heard him say it before, Jordan Peterson says, I act as if God exists. And he usually says that when he's asked, do you believe in God? And it's kind of a cop-out answer, but there's method in his madness, because he fully admits that he is not willing to give up. At one point in his life, he was becoming an atheist. But he doesn't really believe that. That he doesn't believe that there is no God. And he says, I act as if God exists. That's really a way of summing up what the whole message of the gospel was. Because Jesus didn't start out, believe in me. He started out with seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness. You can't actually see God. You can see evidence of God. And, of course, the atheist uses the same evidence to prove that we use that there is a God. He uses to prove that there is not a God, at least the same evidence in nature. So it's a question of interpretation. But the reality is that seeking the kingdom of God, an unseen God, an unknown God, an unnamed God, because that's the way God was always referred to. He was giving the name Yadevah, or Yahweh, because it means that he's the existing one. And so that's what they started calling him, although he's known by many names according to the Testaments. Peterson says he acts as if God exists. That is probably the closest statement to the name of God that you can get, the existing one. He evidently believes enough that God exists that he is going to act according. His actions will manifest the fact that God exists, the existing one. He also says, I would never claim to be good, because he was I think Prager or somebody in an interview referred to him that he was a good man. And he said, I would never claim to be good. I think it's dangerous. But I did become terrified of how terrible I could be. The best, he goes on to say, is to avoid pathways that lead people to the back places that, the dark places they go. And so that, anyway, so he talks about his hope of approximating good. Well, they called Jesus good, and he questioned them, why do you call me good? None is good but God. God is goodness. God is light. God is truth. That whatever God is, he is those things. And Jesus, who probably had a better right to claim to be good, says, why you call me good? None is good but God. That's very close to the statement about Jordan Peterson yet. I'm sure people will find all kinds of criticisms of what he's saying. But he's talking about avoiding the pathways that lead people to dark places that they go. Well, what is the Ten Commandments but guidelines to tell you to avoid the dark places? Don't murder. Don't bear false witness. I mean, that's one of Jordan Peterson's 12 rules is don't lie. Don't. All the thou shalt nots of the Ten Commandments are basically telling you how to avoid the wrong path, the dark places. So again, that's a very Christian message, although I don't know that you even want to put him in those category as some kind of Christian pastor minister. But he sometimes hits things much closer than what I'm hearing coming out of some of the more successful so-called Christian preachers in the media. But anyway, again, I'm mentioning this to kind of set the groundwork of where we're going. What's happened is society has become ill. It's become sick. It's become degenerate. And we've quoted Polybius as to why society is becoming degenerate is because it's becoming selfish. It is becoming content with living at the expense of others and depending upon others for their livelihood. And that's what socialism does. I also read, one of the people I read on the dark web, intellectual dark web, is Michael Malice, who is an anarchist who claims democracy, like communism, only works in theory. But somebody said, but I say that even in theory, anarchism doesn't work. Well, the fact is all these systems of government, anarchism, communism, socialism, democracies, that's not what makes something work. What makes, being a bit of a redneck and making lots of equipment work sometimes outside of its original intent of the designer, just hooking things together and making them function so that they actually work because of limited resources. I understand that what makes something work is the heart and soul of that thing, and that is only provided by the individual, which goes back to you don't need a majority in order to instigate change in your universe, in your world. You need to light that candle. So that's what we're going to try to do, is take a look at some of the things that help light a candle and some of the things that bring darkness, to avoid those dark paths and avoid those things that take you in the wrong direction.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
So, continuing our discussion on structure of government, one of the answers I sent back to the people having their discussion with the Michael Malice was, which I kind of wonder. I wonder if that is his real name. It's kind of Michael Malice. But anyway, all forms of government or non-government, which anarchism is non-rulers. It's not non-government. It's non-rulers. But all forms of government or non-government only work in theory. That's the only place they really work, because that's not what makes a government work. The system, the form, isn't what makes it work. Because what makes the thing work is the heart and soul, the spirit of the people who populate that form of government. Seeking the kingdom of God is seeking the form of God, but it doesn't do you any good to go to church or to read the Bible or any of these things unless you are willing to receive the Spirit of God. Another thing I posted was somebody was talking about free speech, and I was looking at Twitter. I keep, every time I look at Twitter, I think, can anything good come out of Twitter? There is so much, I see so many lost souls floundering around on Twitter. But, I mean, it can have a place, but, boy, it is not a solution. And, of course, government is not the solution, and form of government is not the solution. The solution is that men must change. And you can't change other men unless you become some sort of a dictator, and chances are you'll change them for the worse. The one person you can have an effect on and change is you. But you don't know how to change you into what you are not molded by yourself. We live in a created universe, in a world, whether you want to believe that we're created by evolution and the chance of chemistry, where this all just came about by accident, or whether there was a creator-designer who is behind it all, which creates the patterns that we see. Whichever way you want to think about it, you can't create yourself. In neither one of those scenarios are you creating yourself. You must allow something else to have influence over you, something greater than you. Whether it's the mass of creation and the stars and astrology or whatever, or if it is the divine Spirit of God moving through the universe. You can't create yourself. Neither one of those scenarios, which are both probably inaccurate because of your image of God. When we have this image of God, most people who go to church, they don't actually worship God. They worship the image of God, which they have created in their own minds or allowed somebody else to create in their minds. If you actually, and I think this is one of the things that Jordan Peterson might be stumbling on in his subconscious anyway, is that he understands that people mostly just believe in an image of God that they create in their own mind, and he doesn't want to create that image. He just knows that he needs to act as if God exists and not try to put God into some sort of imagery or philosophy or ideology, that he just operates as if God exists, and he struggles daily to figure out how he can get closer to those divine properties of righteousness that God claims to be the producer of. And so that's really a very healthy place to be, is to believe that I need to act as if God exists. I don't know what God is. I can't define God. I'm a finite creature. How can I define an infinite entity that is God? I can't do it. It's beyond my capacity as a finite creature. All I can do is seek to do the righteousness of a righteous God, whatever that is. And that's a daily desire and hope. He even uses the word hope. Hope is an important thing that a lot of us, people who already think they're saved, and they don't have to do anything to be saved. They just thought a thought and said some words, and they saved themselves by saying these words. They live in their imagination. That does not really, in actuality, bring them any closer to the righteousness of God. God says, if you really believe in me, according to the Bible, if you really believe in me, you will keep my commandments. If you're having trouble keeping those commandments, that is evidence to you that you don't really believe in God. If you have become entangled again in the elements of the world and the elements of bondage in the world, then that is evidence to you that you're not really seeking the kingdom of God and his righteousness, or haven't been successfully doing it, because that's why you've become merchandise and surety for debt and cursed your children with debt. All those things we can see. I can show you in the news. You have cursed your children with debt. I can probably find you a web page that has a debt clock where the numbers are just zooming by, going up and up and up and up and up and up, and your children will be expected to pay that back. That's pretty much a curse. That's a done deal. You have a new child and you think you know so much because you have a degree of knowledge, and you think you believe in something that is greater than yourself, maybe. Maybe you don't even believe in God. But your newborn child is in debt. And that debt is growing faster than that child can grow. How did you get in such a circumstance? If you were in the bondage of Egypt, you had to pay 20% of everything you produced to the government, and that was called bondage. But today you pay 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70%. Just income tax might be 20%. Then there's property tax, and there's sales tax, and there's all these other taxes that are placed upon you, and that's because you're entangled again in the yoke of bondage. You're not a free people. That's one of the things you also see on the intellectual dark web, that people think they're still free, but they've covenanted with people who don't really believe in God but believe in their own power. So, we talked a lot in the last weeks about the New Deal and how the New Deal was the old deal, and it was the creation of literally the imperial cult of Rome in the United States, and what you would call public religion. Social Security is a religious program. It's how you take care of the widows and orphans and needy of your society. That's what pure religion was taking care of the orphans and needy and the widows of your society, unspotted by the constitutional orders and systems of government. That's what pure religion was. Well, the New Deal was the world provided providing for the widows and orphans of your society, not through free will offerings that they mention in the Old Testament, or the charity that Jesus and Paul talk about. But the New Deal was going to take care of the needy of your society through men who exercise authority and force the contributions of the people. This was going directly against John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. The New Deal was anti-Christ, totally anti-Christ. And, as we examined and showed by people like Henry Morgenthau, who devised the plan, was instrumental in producing the plan, that it didn't work. It failed. And yet people are still coming out of college thinking the New Deal worked. We need to go back to that. No, it didn't. And the evidence is overwhelming that it didn't. Yet people think they're going to solve some problems, and they're laboring under these false assumptions. But you'll have to go back and listen to those other programs because we're not going to go through all that. But one of the things Henry Morgenthau Jr., actually he was a junior, did say is never in history of the world has there been a situation so bad that the government can't make it worse. So that was the guy who was probably one of the most instrumental creators of the New Deal. Eventually came to that conclusion. He didn't have that when he was inventing the New Deal, but the New Deal was Nimrod's deal. It was Cain's deal. It was the men who exercise authority were going to provide the welfare of the people by forcing the contributions of the people. In Tocqueville, which I said I was going to be talking more about Tocqueville in the days to come because of the fact that he did this extensive study of the democracy that he calls the United States. See, because the United States was a democracy from the beginning. The states were republics. And together, when they confederated, the entire Americas was literally a republic. But the creation of the United States is clearly not creating a republic, but creating a democracy. You just read the instructions, read the Constitution. They're creating an indirect democracy. But they are trying with the Constitution of limiting the power of that indirect democracy. And it was also prescribed in the Constitution that it was to guarantee that Republican form of government that most people lived under or in or with that was in America. But the United States itself is a democracy. It's not a republic. And it's supposed to, like I say, protect a republic, guarantee that republic, but it also guarantees your right to contract. So if you abandon the principles of a republic, if you go down some of those dark paths that Peterson and God and Moses and Abraham have talked about, then you will curse your children and you will become merchandise. And, of course, those dark paths are paths without light. That's all a dark path is, without light, without the wisdom. So, if anybody, and I understand a lot of people, if you mention religion, if you mention the Bible, people, begin to edge towards the door. And that's because modern Christianity and modern pastors and modern preachers, with their mamby-pamby ways, with their watered-down gospels, have absolutely devastated the love and respect that you might have for these people that actually did produce liberty in the world during the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I heard somebody referring to Gibbon's book as the rise of the Roman Empire, but it's actually the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It wasn't the empire rising that he was writing about. It is how it declined, and of course that's why we quote people 150 years before Christ, like Polybius, who explains why it will fall. And And the fact is, we've gone down that dark path until society has become ill. And so we're going to look at a number of things before we're done with this section on the narcissistic nature of society. We've really gone a long ways away from what was originally intended by people like Madison and even Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists. American people have fallen into the habit of expecting government to solve all problems, removing risks from their lives, security, they wanted security, and providing for all their needs and wants. It is commonplace now for individuals to look to government rather than the family, or even what this individual, this is actually Paul Rahe, I probably got his name wrong, it's Rahe, and he wrote Soft Despotism, Democratic Drift, and he's kind of reviewing, I think, Matthew Spaulding's Is the Despotism That Tocqueville Feared Inevitable? Because Tocqueville wrote about the dangers of despotism coming out of this democracy in America, and he wrote this back in the 1840s. But he refers to, rather than look to family and civil society, I wouldn't use the word civil. And I saw somebody on the intellectual dark web, and I called them out on it, that talking about that we have to learn to be civil. Civil law is the law that men make for themselves. Natural law is also defined as divine will. It's also defined as right reason. These are synonymous phrases. Natural law, divine will, right reason. That has nothing to do with the civil law. Civil laws are created supposedly within the concept of natural law. But civil law is the law that men make for themselves. It's your social compacts that you create. If you take from somebody, you owe them back. It's like you have an absolute right to swing your fists all around you as long as you don't come into contact with somebody else's chin or face or head or body, because then you begin to infringe upon their rights. And as you judge that's okay, then they get to infringe upon your rights. That's why covetous practices make you merchandise, because if you desire the sweat and toil of your neighbor gets to desire the sweat and toil of you. As you judge, so shall ye be judged. That's like the laws of physics. You can't change that. That's just there. And so what happens when you disregard that, when you think that law is not in place, you are likely to go down the dark path because you have denied the truth of that law, that natural law of the universe, the mystery of the universe. It's only a mystery when you don't see it. That's why, the mysteries of the universe, the secrets of the universe, they're all there. They're not secret. They're only secret to you because you've chosen to live in the dark. You've chosen not to see that. If you want hope to come back into your life, you have to be willing to see the evil, the darkness of your own hearts. You have to be willing to walk into those dark chambers and bring light in to see them, willing to see them. So anyway, rather than look to the family or the righteousness of society would, in my opinion, be a better way to phrase that. To relieve their most ordinary concerns, support their basic endeavors, and make good on the simplest injuries anticipated in daily life. Injuries like what? When somebody's swinging their arms around and they hit you in the face, or they want to be able to drive anywhere they want and they run over your stuff and smash it and destroy it. What do you have to protect you from that indiscriminate foolishness of others? Well, some people try to devise governments to protect them from that. And they give power to somebody who might be considered their neighbor to protect them from those injuries. The reality is that's your job, every individual's job. As soon as you centralize that job into the hands of police or sheriffs or government, you have negated your responsibility to your neighbor. This is why I have another article about hue and cry. The hue and cry of every man to the protection of every other man. If you desire to be protected by your neighbor, you must desire to protect your neighbor. And you don't desire to give the power, your responsibility of protecting your neighbor, to somebody else. You maintain that responsibility. Now, how do you do that? Well, you can't do that practically in the universe unless you connect with your neighbor. Somebody sent me a story last night. One of our ministers sent me a story that he must have come across. It happened in Klamath County, and a guy went up to, go out into the woods and live deliberately or whatever, the Thoreau kind of survive off the land, get off the grid. And he ended up in a situation where he killed his neighbor. And it's a long story. It took me quite a while to read it, but I was waiting for somebody to return. So it kept me awake reading this story. But he didn't have anybody to turn to. He kept dialing 911 and expecting the government to help him. And it was short. I'm familiar with the sheriffs and the deputies, and as a matter of fact, some of the people mentioned in the story I know of. But he wanted to divorce himself and become this recluse and independent of society, and then when he was in trouble, when somebody was flailing their arms around about to kill him, he wanted everybody to come to his assistance. And he'd already gone down that dark path. He was totally dependent upon a disability check to even survive. And all it did was weaken him and weaken him and weaken him. He wanted to become this independent individual dependent upon a disability check. And then when he needed help, he was dependent upon the sheriff's department. And he had no friends. It's because his life was not about setting others free. It was about freeing himself. That's a dark path to go down. That's not the path of Christ. That's not the path of Abraham. It's not the path of Moses. You have to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the guy did go out and he helped neighbors and he would help other people a lot of times. But he also became this recluse and cornered himself eventually so he could barely help anybody because of his desire to get away from everybody else. You don't want to get away from it. You want to go and help other people. You don't want to help them in a way that strengthens them. The way he went weakened him, made him more vulnerable. Made him so that the sharks and wolves of the world were drawn to attacking him. And then nobody was drawn to saving him because he had isolated his own soul. You can't do that, which is why we are told not forsake the gathering together. Why we need to gather together in the tens, hundreds, and thousands as commanded by Christ, as advised by Jethro, as also implemented by Joshua, and clearly was a part of the building of the altars of Abraham, for those who understand the altars of Abraham. And again, we have articles at Preparing You, and we're going to be spreading those articles around and putting them in a form where people can actually take a bite out of them. Some of them are so meaty that people can't. And they have to come. They read these things, and then they go away for a year, and then they come back, And it haunts them because they saw some truth in these articles, and they come back. You're not going to have the time to keep going away and then coming back. You need to start your personal journey towards the kingdom, and one of the ways to do that is to care enough about one another to gather in the tens, hundreds, and thousands, which is why Jesus made it so important that you do, that he actually commanded his disciples to make the people organize themselves in that fashion, in groups of 10, in ranks of 100, and in that case, ranks of 50, because there were 5,000 men in their families there in that group, and so they had to organize them. If there was 10,000, he would have said in ranks of 100, ranks of 10, and ranks of 100, and ranks of 1,000, because of the fact that the idea was to, everybody was coming together so that they would start to care about one another as much as they care about themselves. If you believe in Jesus, you have to believe in that, because that's what he said. And you would be keeping his commandments, and you would be doing that. But people resist that. You know why? One of the main reasons they resist that is when you have to come in contact with others, their light may shine in your darkness. Their mere presence, they don't even have to do anything overtly as a design. It's just going to come about. Their presence is going to expose your weakness. But as Paul says, in your weakness is your strength. And at least he said it about himself. And my weakness is my strength. Because you're willing to see your weakness. You're willing to see your faults. And that's kind of what we're seeing in the whole Jordan Peterson phenomena, is that he's talking about taking back responsibilities and looking at yourself and cleaning up your own area, your own room, your own life. Not go down the dark path. You can't change yourself, but you can be changed when you're willing to lay down your life for others. And the beginning of that is to take a look at yourself. In Democracy in America, which is a book by Alex Tocqueville, I guess there's no R in that, he warned of a tendency of democracies bent on bringing about equal results in all cases. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.